Hi everyone, I hope you're well in the age of coronavirus and all that malarkey. Now basically what I've done here is put together a few slides just to overview the drop vertical jump, its role in screening and therefore its role in injury prevention. We'll take a look at a few example papers first and foremost, before then jumping on to Excel. I suppose it's my attempt in the age of quarantine in effect, to give you some kind of practical task or practical data at least, for you to spend a little time considering and appraising. So just to set the scene with how impactful ACL injuries are in football. What we've got here is a depiction of the frequency of footballing related injuries alongside the severity, with severity basically the number of days that the player can expect to lose when they suffer said injury. And if we focus on the ACL tear, given the focus of the session, we see that that's associated with about 200 days time lost, so no training and competition during that period. That said, it's not that frequent in injury, whereas if we compare that to something like the hamstring strain, which is I suppose the other end of the continuum, whereby it's very frequent but it's not as severe an injury, we get kind of two sides of the same coin, I suppose. So if we only look at frequency, we would say that the ACL tear isn't something that we need to worry about. However, if we only look at severity, we'd say that it's the worst problem, the worst injury that a footballer could suffer. But that doesn't quite tell the full picture. The full picture is depicted by the product of incidents in terms of how frequently the injury arises alongside the severity. Now if we were to just take a look at the data from this particular study, there were during I think it's something like a kind of 10-year Champions League based study. Basically any team that enters the Champions League and has entered in a number of years has been enrolled into this particular data set. So might be wrong with the 10 years, but I certainly know, or I'm confident in saying, that it applies to Champions League teams over a number of years. So basically your elite of the professional teams. Basically over the study period, however long that might be, they recorded 78 ACL tears, and obviously if you take 78 multiply it by 200, that gives you lots of days, i.e. 15,600. And a recent example of this somewhat interestingly dressed football player, Hector Bellerin, basically saw him rupture his ACL ligament during a rapid change of direction. I suppose a bit of acceleration, propulsive acceleration in a particular direction. I'll try and play the clip and hopefully you'll be able to see. Basically the excuse me, the tibial tuberosity, the kind of bony prominent part that sits underneath the patella, just kind of flips out. I don't know if I'll be able to play that again, but you can watch it back if you're that way inclined in your own time. Probably in combination with a bit of knee valgus and hip rotation as well. He's basically ruptured his ACL, and just to clarify, I suppose, how impactful an injury this is, not only in the number of days lost. You know, if I was the owner of a football club, so long as there's someone to fill his boots, let's say, I wouldn't be too bothered. Apart from the fact that someone like Hector Bellerin was out for 36 weeks, so was out for a good length of time following ACL reconstruction. At the time, his salary, God knows how, was £110,000 per week, and if we take the product of those two values, that pretty much tells us that Arsenal had to foot a bill to the tune of £4 million really for a player who wasn't able to compete. So not only is it impactful to squad availability, so on and so forth, there's clearly a high financial cost that goes with ACL ruptures. ACL ruptures probably aren't the number one issue in football. That would be the hamstring injury, whereby the severity isn't so high. If you suffer something like a grade 1, perhaps grade 2 hamstring strain, you're out for about 21 days on average. But because they're so frequent, the burden associated with hamstring injury just about outstrips that associated with ACL tears. Nevertheless, clearly an ACL rupture, a significant injury in football. Now, just to further dwell upon the point, I suppose, a little, in the Bundesliga, they've conducted some analyses of knee injuries in a general sense, and then their relative cost. So if we look at some of the data points in the Bundesliga in particular, knee injuries account for 15% of all injuries. So they're not, that would, I suppose, suggest that they're not that important, or not that they're unimportant, just that there might be other things that are causing and producing more injuries. So they're only associated with 15% of all injuries. That said, the cost associated with knee injuries, even when the proportion of total injuries is only 15%, is pretty much 50% of all medical costs associated with injury. So clearly that reinforces the impact, I suppose, of a knee injury, and why therefore screening practices are quite useful. Focusing a little more specifically upon ACL injuries, we see that really these are the kind of underlying cost, or a significant component of the cost of those overall knee injuries. So the previous slide, knee injuries in general. This slide, ACL ruptures specifically. They're accounting for less than 1% of all injuries in the main, a bit of fluctuation around 1%. However, the medical cost, including player wages and stuff of the like, accounts for, let's say, pretty much a third of the medical costs of all injuries. So clearly they don't happen very often, but when they do, they're impactful and they cost a bloody bomb. I'll crack on. Probably worth bearing in mind that I'm losing light, so I've had to put the light on in the house, and unfortunately my missus has been buying a big bloody daft thing that looks like that, and its placement unfortunately makes me look like some kind of godlike individual, so just bear with me. That's not what I'm trying to convey here at all, but if I switch it off I am into darkness, so well, no, the lesser of two evils perhaps. Anyway, onto more sensible matters. So we've, I suppose, up to this point determined that the ACL is at risk. It's at significant risk, and obviously it's quite a severe injury when it arrives, let's say, given how long it can put people out for, how much it costs, not even, and we haven't even touched on the long-term prognosis, which we'll probably see people suffering with early age osteoarthritis of the knee joint. That then obviously brings a reduction in quality of life, and then they might even need a total knee replacement, so on and so forth. So we haven't even got that far really, but that then just reinforces how important it is to try and prevent ACL ruptures. Lots of weird and wonderful ways in which these kind of injuries can be prevented. But obviously, to get a handle on who's at risk, I suppose, and in line with the purpose of screening tests, we need to know, I suppose, who's at risk, and therefore, to arrive at that point, we need to use decent tests that kind of place a high degree of strain on the knee. Let's say to look at the mechanics of movement. Let's say when people are asked to produce, high force at a rapid rate during sporting like activities, and that's essentially where the drop vertical jump test comes in. It's a dynamic movement whereby an individual would drop off a platform, typically about 30 centimeters in height, or step off. Upon initial contact, flex at the knees and then perform an explosive jump. So there are, in essence, I suppose, two contact phases: the initial drop off the platform and then the subsequent contact following the jump that they produced. And as part of that movement technique, people have quantified. When I say people, I mean clever people like you lot, i.e. biomechanists, have quantified all sorts of weird and wonderful variables, all of which you'll probably be quite familiar with by now in terms of the 3D analysis that underpins it. You'll certainly know that kind of content better than myself. So just to describe the technique, it looks like so. Box of 31 centimeters. I've never really read the justification for why 31 centimeters, but kind of trying to second guess, I can only envisage that it's somewhere around the height that the average individual would displace their centre of mass when performing something like a squat jump or a counter movement jump. It's probably there or thereabouts. Certainly not for basketball players and people of the like who are explosively trained, let's say. But in the general population, 31 centimeters might be an adequate platform height, let's say. But fundamentally, its purpose is to produce this initial contact. So the initial position sees the individual stood on the platform. They'll then step off with one foot. They'll perform a landing on both feet. Ideally, you'd have a force plate under the left and right legs to look at things like symmetry of the various variables, let's say. But when they land, the idea is to come into contact with the force plates as briefly as possible, whilst also producing a maximal vertical jump. They perform the vertical jump and then they land upon the force plates for a second time. So that process there is the drop vertical jump in essence, and it's frequently used for many reasons. Frequently used as a screening tool to look at, who's demonstrating risky biomechanics, let's say. So just a bit of context, I suppose, to the task that I've set associated with the drop vertical jump. Basically, before COVID-19 kicked in, I stole the portable force plate. I say stole, I've temporarily borrowed, but that might turn into a permanent bloody borrow the way things are going. Anyway, I brought home with me a few bits of kit, one of which was the portable force plate, which only gives you kind of vertical ground reaction force. And basically, I have dropped it on to this force plate, unlucky for the force plate, given my recent nutritional intake, let's say. But I've dropped onto the force plate 3 times, and then I've uploaded or I've exported the data from the BioWare software the bioair data logger, I can't remember the specifics of it, into CSV files, Excel files even, and basically on the next slide or two, I overview using a kind of video screen capture what I've done, the different functions, and fundamentally what I want you to do is break down the drop vertical jump into the different phases, pick out things like peak force of the initial landing, rate of force development, same again for the second landing. You might even go above and beyond and quantify other things like kind of flight time and therefore try to predict jump height, the kind of weird and wonderful things you biomechanists tend to do anyway. So look at my kind of tutorial overview, replicate it with the first trial, and then there are a further 2 trials for you to just spend time practicing. Really, this is just for your perusal, I suppose, to have a bit of data, pick it apart where the drop vertical jump is concerned, and that's the task. If you've got any questions about the Excel files or the analysis, or you've done extra analysis and you fancy sharing that with me, wink wink, that would be grand. But really it's just an opportunity for you to have a little bash at the data. Any questions, just get in touch. Other than that, thank you very much, and hopefully it's been somewhat useful anyway. Look after yourselves, and I will hopefully see you one day, maybe, if we're lucky. Okay, so essentially what I've done is I've completed 3 drop vertical jump tests, and all I've got is the force plate data, vertical ground reaction force, owing to that procedure that I took myself through. So your 3 files are on Portal. I've put this kind of answer one up there, obviously for a bit of reference, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, your let's say your raw trials will just have the 2 columns. They've got time in the first one, and then I think, if I've got this right, it was recording at let's have a little look. It was recording at 50 hertz, so 50 kind of samples per second. And I suppose I just want you to have a mess around with the data, pick out the peak ground reaction forces, a couple of ratios that are often published in relevant studies as well as these kind of contact durations. So first column is time, second column is obviously the force that's been recorded at that given moment. Just worth bearing in mind that you'll find lots of values kind of hovering around 0. That's just kind of, I suppose, the natural natural noise, let's say. So mine was on laminate flooring. I was moving around the force plate whilst I wasn't on it, stood on a platform, so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of kind of residual noise, let's say, a little fluctuation in the values, but in general, anything less than 20 newtons, you'd put down to just this kind of fluctuating noise, let's say. And then as we make our way down, we get to values that look like I've landed on the force platform. There's a bit of a rise and then a fall, which is me essentially flexing the knees following the first land, before then an increase in force once more again. Come down to 994, you'll notice a kind of second spike. Before that then drops off to 0 type values. That's me now technically in the air for a brief period of time before I land second time round, flex the knees, extend the knees, and then I'm basically stood on top of the force plate again, albeit not very still at that moment. However, by the time we get to these kind of values, this is me just kind of now stepping off the force plate, let's say. So first thing I want you to do is put a figure together. Dead easy to do. You could basically just take that data there. So highlight column B, go to insert, line graph would do the trick. And there you are. Now that basically gives quite a nice kind of visual depiction of what was going on. So from this point to that point, I was stood on the box, so I wasn't on the force plate. I land on the force plate, peak ground reaction force for the first landing. I then flex the knees, that reduces the contact force temporarily. Before then I extend the knees to produce the jump, and obviously as I take off from the jump, the force plate registers values of 0. That's me in the air, so I'm not actually in contact with the force plate. And then bang, second landing produces a peak ground reaction force there of about 2,500 newtons. Before then, obviously, I begin to flex the knees and dissipate that force. And then at that point, I basically stepped off the force plate. So that gives a nice depiction of what went on. That said, at the minute, the horizontal axis is 1 to 500. We want to change that. So click on the chart, click on select data, which is in the chart design option just here if you haven't got that. You'll see the 1 to 5, which is like 1 to 500 almost, yeah, 1 to 500. We want to change that to time. So click edit, and then you want to go like that and just drag all the way down. Such that you've got the entire 10 seconds that the data was being recorded. If I jump back up here now, we should have time along the bottom. Grand. That's going to be quite useful in us depicting these contact times and stuff of the like a little later on. So that's the first thing to do. Next thing I want you to do is calculate this here. So this is the force as a multiple of my own body weight. So you'll notice over here, I've typed these in. 789 is my body weight. Should say BW, tut. Body weight in newtons. And basically the equation looks like that. So I've gone equals, I click on B2, / E2. You'll notice that I've got a dollar symbol before the E and before the 2. What that basically does is allows me to lock the focus. When I drag that equation down now, it will always refer back to E2. Now if I just show you what would happen if I didn't have my dollar symbols in, like that, and then I drag that formula down, I'm going to start getting error messages because it will move both cells down one, and then when I'm down to here, it's now looking for B4 and E4. It's dragged the initial focus down 2 cells. Obviously I don't want that, which is why if you put those dollar symbols in, it will lock the focus, so when you drag it, it will always refer back to E2. So if I click on that one there, that one's moved down because I want it to, but I also want it to go back or be referred to the denominator, which is in E2. That then basically tells me, as a multiple of my own body weight, how much force was I generating, with values, I suppose, upwards of about 3 times someone's body weight, typically being, let's say somewhat risky. And I get up to the dizzy heights of 2.44 times my own body weight first time round. So a fairly heavy landing, to be honest. And then 2.16 in that instance. Whereas when it's the land from the jump at 3.24 seconds, that was over 3 times my own body weight, suggesting obviously that that's a great deal of force that I've generated on that second landing. So having quantified the ground reaction forces according to my own body weight. We've got everything we need then, essentially, to kind of annotate this figure for the points of interest that we'd expect to see in the literature, at least anyway. Now what I've done is I've got two kind of annotated figures that look like this. You won't have that just yet. You'll have the figure within its own sheet, let's say, within this data sheet, this kind of initial tab. To move it to its own sheet, click on it, and this just kind of makes it larger and easier to work with. Click on the figure, click move chart, and then you want it as a new sheet, and you can call it whatever you want. So I've obviously said drop vertical jump figure for the first one. Click OK on that. That will give you that figure that you've just created, this one here, in its own sheet like this. So again, it just makes it a little easier to view and work with, let's say. So the points of interest, you've got a few things to take a nose at, and you can do this just by hovering over the figure itself. So here it says point 2.2, value 1928.71. The 2.2 pertains to the time along the horizontal axis, and obviously then the value pertains to the ground reaction force, 1928.71. The only issue with that is sometimes it might give you a slightly wrong value if you're not quite hovering over the exact point of interest, let's say. So if I was a little lazy with my cursor, I could say that the takeoff was completed at 2.2 seconds, whereas if I went a little further along, obviously then say 1.9 or whatever it might be, 2.1 there. So that's the only issue with using the cursor, but as a kind of general approach, hover over and take your value. Now here all I've done to annotate, I've gone insert, illustrations, shapes, and then added a text box. So once you draw your text box like that, you can just type away. I've then added the arrows in the same manner, insert, illustrations, shapes, pick an arrow, and then obviously you can draw them accordingly. But I suppose what I'll do now is I'll kind of stop going on about Excel and the workings and just talk to the various points that I've annotated, let's say, and those that you'd expect to see in the literature. So first and foremost, the peak ground reaction force from the initial land. I've got recorded a value of here 1,928 newtons, which I suppose is over twice my body weight. We'll look at that in a moment. I've then flexed the knees, and then at this point that would be me then beginning to increase or extend at the knee joint again to produce a takeoff. So this is the peak takeoff force as it's known, and I generated a force of 1,704 newtons. Now something that you'll often see in the literature is this drop landing to takeoff force ratio, which is what I've got over here. So essentially the landing force was 1.13 times the size of the takeoff force. I suppose ideally you'd want a kind of value closer to 1. So if you're landing with a real kind of heavy force and then not really taking off with a great deal of force, that suggests that from a biomechanical perspective that's the wrong way around, let's say. Ideally we'd want the takeoff force to kind of match the landing forces, let's say. If there's a kind of real obvious discrepancy, then that suggests that landing technique might not be fantastic. So that's that second value, and that's the ratio that's often depicted in the literature. And what we tend to see is in let's say prepubescent males, that ratio will be fairly high when they're, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, and then over the course of puberty, that value would then reduce to values in this kind of region here, 1.13, 1.14, 1.15, which is obviously a little more preferable, let's say. The next value that's been recorded is the peak jump landing force, and this is basically the peak ground reaction force when I landed from my own jump, and that's a fair bit high. Technically, it shouldn't really be a great deal higher, though I must admit the force plate that I was landing on and to isn't that large. If I was to hazard a guess, probably about 30 centimeters by 20. So I did find it a little tricky kind of landing with, you know, ideal biomechanics, particularly from that second jump, because I'd landed and then, you know, explosive jump in the air, trying to land perfectly on there with nicely flexed knees and stuff. Obviously, I didn't quite manage that in this instance. Nevertheless, that's another point of interest, let's say, with the drop vertical jump test. We've then got, what have I gone for? Rate of force development and contact durations. Basically, the rate of force development is how much force was generated over what period of time. So and I've colour coded the kind of amber to go with the first landing, the green to go with the second landing. But basically what you depict is the time at which the initial contact was made. Now, if I hover over there, I only get 2.1, and over here I've got 2.14 seconds. That's because in this file here, if we go down to 2.14, this is the point at which ground reaction force, I just said that was the initial contact because it's apparent that following that point there was obviously me landing on the force plate. So I said that was initial contact, 2.14, and the force was 13.81 newtons at that moment, but we can kind of forget about that. I then said the peak ground reaction force from that drop land was 1,928 newtons. So obviously that's the highest value around this area, let's say. I've then got, if I jump back to my figure, I've got the contact taking place at 2.14 seconds, and I've got the peak being registered in newtons of 1,928 newtons, which took place 0.04 seconds afterwards. If you then take 1928, divide that by essentially 0.04, i.e. the difference between these two values, that gives you a rate of force development of nearly 50,000 newtons per second, which isn't kind of, you know, a risk factor in and of itself, but certainly it's plausible that if you're generating substantially high values where the rate of force development is concerned, that's suggesting you're putting a high load through the joints, the musculature, so on and so forth, which obviously then does suggest that there might be some risk at play in that scenario. That kind of value, though, 48,000, somewhat typical of the literature, whereby general observations have been made of the rate of force development in these kind of tests. I unfortunately can't comment off the top of my head with regards to whether there are proposed cut-offs, let's say, for the rate of force development for the drop vertical jump tests. Essentially down here then, I've just done the same again. So I've quantified the rate of force development for the second landing. And I suppose what's somewhat interesting, let's say, if we just look at the peak ground reaction force, we would say that the second landing, i.e. when I made contact following the jump rather than contact following the drop off the force plate, that would suggest that basically the second landing is the risky one because the ground reaction force was substantially higher. However, what we've got here is, granted, a higher ground reaction force, but a higher ground reaction force being dissipated, let's say, over 0.06 seconds, so that's 3.24 minus 3.18, compared to 0.04 seconds in this instance. So I've generated a higher force, but I've generated that higher force over a slightly longer period of time, 0.02 seconds to be specific. What that basically has done to the rate of force development is produced a value that's, let's say, just about 7,000 newtons per second lower in the second contact. That then would suggest that that's the kind of more favourable landing pattern of the two, because I wasn't putting as much force in as rapid a time period relative to the initial drop landing. So there might be additional information in this rate of force development compared to just the use of ground reaction force itself, let's say. If you're just wondering where the kind of 2.14 and 2.18 come from, basically, if I was to zoom into the figure, that point there is 2.14, not that the pop-up window is telling me that, but that peak force there arrives at 2.18. Likewise, for the second landing, I've got 3.18 and 3.24. Time-wise, that there is 3.18, that's 3.24. So it's how long it takes from initial contact down here to the peak, to the subsequent peak, that gives us this contact duration, let's say. And it's not contact duration in the sense of, how long was someone's feet in contact with the ground. These are kind of two distinct components of biomechanical jumping technique, let's say. What I've basically got in the next figure is essentially the same data again, albeit this time I've used the third column, which is the one that you calculated yourselves. Yeah. So this is the ground reaction force relative to my own body weight. And again, I've just picked out the same points of interest, a little less colour coding going on, unfortunately. But essentially, it would look something like this, wouldn't it? As was the case in the first image there. So in this instance here, we've got a peak ground reaction force of 2.44 times my body weight. So if we were to take 789, that's my body weight, multiply 789 by 2.44, I can almost put my mortgage on the fact that you would get that value there, 1928. So same figure, same everything else. All I'm doing is I'm using the multiple of body weight rather than the raw ground reaction force. On this one here as well, I've added the time to peak, because that's essentially what's being quantified here with this initial contact to peak ground reaction force point of interest. Okay, hopefully that's a useful summary of the Excel-based analyses that I'm hoping you might get stuck into. Have a little nose down the file here, because I've kind of depicted what's going on and when, and that rate of force development, that's the equation that I've just spoke about, albeit kind of entered in Excel language here. So it's the peak force divided by the time difference between those 2 points there. I've got initial contact there. What's the next one? So this will be the peak takeoff force rather than the ground reaction force from the landing. So just before I began to depart from the force plate, that was the maximum amount of force I put through the force plate. And then I've got the initial contact for the second landing here. Any questions about this sheet, give me a shout on email or Microsoft Teams, whatever works. And I suppose then just bear in mind, if you want a bit of practice, you've got 3 trials to work with as well, rather than just the first trial, because that's all I've done. I'm not going to do all 3 for you. I want you to do some of the work, yeah? Okay, as I say, any questions, get in touch. Other than that, stay safe and hopefully speak to you soon.